Okay, here we go. Well, hello and welcome to my channel. This is Lutz, and thanks for tuning in. Hope my contents will be helpful to you and will be fun, as it is for me. The song that you're listening to is a song I'm working on right now. It's called Ich reiß dich raus. And let's have a listen. Today's topic is going to be how to achieve spectral balance in your mixes, and I think it's going to be quite interesting. So let's just get into this. Why is this interesting? Spectral balance means achieving a good distribution of energy in the sound spectrum that you have available for your mixes. And good distribution, when I say that, I mean it's the distribution of each instrument in its place. Now, why can't we just, put all the instruments together and let it play? This doesn't work because each instrument needs its place in the spectrum. Otherwise, we will have something that is called masking. And masking needs to be explained, maybe. For those of you who already know what masking is, I'll keep it short. But masking is important in the context of what we are discussing today. So masking is really a property of the human hearing. It means that signals that we hear, that come into the ear and are processed by the ear as a biological system, they tend to cancel each other out. If you're hearing a certain signal, let's say it's at a certain frequency, then your ear will be less sensitive for other signals at the same frequency. Just to illustrate, I think I'll just look it up. Right, we have this Wikipedia channel here, and that is the picture that I want to talk about, so I'm just going to zoom it in for you. So we have really 4 measurements here, and it is about illustrating and describing really the masking effects at certain frequencies: 250 Hertz, 500 Hertz, 1 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz. And the measurement setup for this is like this. You have a human test subject with headphones on, just like me. And it's like when you do these hearing tests, right? When you're at the doctor's and like trying to find out how good is my hearing. They send to this test subject a narrow band noise signal at a certain frequency, let's say 1 kilohertz. It would be this test here. And then sending to this test subject another narrow band noise signal, or maybe also test tone, I'm not sure about that. And they're asking the test subject to just indicate when he or she is about to hear the other signal, the signal with less amplitude or loudness. And the result are these curves that we're seeing here. So these curves are telling us that around the frequency of the dominant signal, this narrow band signal, the other signal needs to be turned up loudest in order to become audible, perceptible to the human ear. And the further we are away from this central frequency, this dominant frequency, the earlier, so to say, the other signal becomes audible. So masking is most prominent around the dominant frequency. The ear becomes less sensitive for other frequencies in the same range. And when we get away from the frequency, say to higher or lower frequencies, the masking effect becomes less prominent, really. So what does this mean in our context? It means that when we have, let's say, an instrument that occupies a dominant frequency, it is prominent at a certain frequency or frequency bands, then the ear will be less susceptible for other instruments who are occupying the same frequency range. And this is, of course, important, because if we have one instrument that we want to hear, then we do not want to have another instrument obstruct exactly what we want. We want everything to be discernible, everything to be, punchy and clear, and not really a spectral mess. So what I want to get into today is how to achieve this kind of balance between instruments in the spectrum regarding the masking under the conditions that we are working in our nice and beautiful homes, like I do here. As I said, I'm in my study, so this is a normal room with a little bit of treatment, but more or less it's like a normal study, which maybe in other homes too. There's a bookshelf here, there's a closet here, there's a desk before me, and there's lots of issues in this room. And the treatment that I did is just to take away some of the issues, mostly phasing. But also there's a total lack of bass response at the point where I'm sitting, because there's no real bass treatment in this room, at least. So it's difficult to listen to sound material in this room in an objective way, because it doesn't represent all the room like maybe a treated studio room would, or properly treated room would. So obviously we need a little help, and I'm going to show you today what kind of process I have found out to be helpful and working for me, and what plugin I use. So let's just get into this. I'm showing to you the plugin that I'm using. It's called the M Multi-Analyzer by Melder Productions. And what this does really is analyze a number of channels and display the spectral analysis in this grid. And I think we just simply go for it and analyze the chorus part, just to see what all the instruments are doing. So that's not really good. So let's just... That's better. So it's interesting to see what all the instruments are doing in the perspective of the sound spectrum. This plugin is quite versatile. You can adjust a lot of parameters, but I'm not going into parameters here. I'm just adjusting this to make it maybe a bit more clear. So what we see here are the different instrument groups, or really instruments. There's the drums in blue, the guitars in yellow, the bass in red, and the vocals in green. And what I want to emphasize here is the characteristic frequencies of each instrument, and frequencies that we want to really pay attention to. Drums, obviously, it's dominated by the bass drum around 80 Hertz. There's a snare drum around 215 maybe. Then there's a dip in the spectrum, and the drums come back in the upper mids and treble region. I think the spike belongs to the snare drum, and then there's a lot of clicking and cymbals going on. All these transient noises that we get when really working the drums are present in this upper mids and treble region. Now, when we combine the drums and the bass guitar, then we have the first challenge really, because obviously in the bass and sub-bass region, they tend to occupy the same frequency or spectrum space, frequency realm. So here's the first challenge. How do we separate the snare drum from the frequency that the bass guitar is using, And what about the bass drum and the notes played by the bass guitar? We need to take care of these aspects and look into them. The guitar has some dominant frequencies also. We have a fair amount of bass in my guitar mix, at least, because the guitars are very low tuned. They're tuned to drop A. So there's a lot of bass going on when someone does palm mutes or plays the lower strings. So the spectrum that I use from my guitars goes really low. It goes more or less to 100 and even maybe a bit lower, but I cut below 100 purposefully. And the guitars kind of mix with the bass guitar in this realm between 100 and 200. And then the guitars take over in the lower mids, and then they have a dip. They have a characteristic frequency around 700, which I find useful to put in, and I explain why later. And then there's a dip again in the mids and upper mids, and then the guitars come back, and they have a dominant frequency here around 3600 hertz. Now let's look at what the vocals are doing. The vocals have a very prominent space here in the upper mids. These are called the formant frequencies, and they are occupied by the resonances that the vocal tract is putting on the vibration that comes from the vocal cords and the resonance that comes from the chest and the human body, really. So the for male voice, or for my voice really, the fundamental frequencies are around here, around 250, 300, 400, depending on, you know, how high the note is that the singer is singing. So this is an important space for the body of the vocals. And in my hearing, since this is work in progress, I'm hearing it like the vocals could be, you know, they're lacking a bit of body and maybe a bit too thin. Then the guitars take over, and then the vocals come back around here, because if the singer sings an R loud or maybe an E loud, where like the nasal cavity comes into play, these frequencies are needed for the, you know, to make the vocal cut through and really make it understandable and make it prominent in these regions. And the treble region here is really occupied by the sibilances. It can be quite prominent too, so if the singer sings an S or an F, then we get a lot of signal here. So I think what we can get from this spectrum, and there's already equalization in place, is that some of the spaces are shared and some of the spaces are separated. For instance, I just mentioned the treble region. It is obviously shared by cymbals and by the sibilances. And also maybe this one, the frequency that is used by the snare drum, or the fundamental that is used by the snare drum, is shared with bass and guitar. Other frequencies are separated, like I mentioned, this space here, and also I call it the body of the guitar tone around 270. And also I like to separate the bass drum from the rest of the instruments. So this separation is really achieved by equalization. And I'm just going to show you what the equalization for the bass drum, for the bass guitar is in my case. So in order to achieve this kind of spectrum characteristic, which has some rectangular shape, I would call it, I use these curves and found them to be useful. I really cut out the frequency, the fundamental of the bass drum. I want this to be left to the bass drum. If the bass guitar plays this note, I want it to be really cut out of the what's happening. This frequency should always be usable and kind of free to use for the bass drum. I cut out this number 4 frequency around 120, 115 to get rid of some boominess, and there's also the tom-toms going on in this region. And then I give a little boost around 200. So to extend the spectrum of the bass guitar up to here and then have it decline quite rapidly. I found it acceptable to have some sharing of a frequency space, so to say, of snare drum, toms, and bass guitar, because these transient elements like toms and bass, toms and snare drum, they are not playing all the time, and when they're playing quite loud, and then they're already gone. Yeah, so in this case, it's acceptable. What's, for instance, not acceptable is to have constant hissing going on. So these frequencies are quite problematic and cause really some concurrency problems. And one example is this frequency here, which is occupied by the guitars. And since the guitars are playing all the time, this frequency is really used by the guitars all the time, more or less. So we want this frequency to be available. What we can also do is watch the development of the spectra over time. I just put it to 100% to just have a static image here. But when we go back and play again, then you can see that the instruments are not occupying all the spaces at once. So there's a development of frequency usage over time. This helps us, of course, because if there's a dominant frequency coming in, maybe doing some temporal masking of another instrument, and then goes out again, then the masking will be gone and the other instrument will come back into the, perception of the listener. So not all of these instruments are really occupying their space and causing masking all the time. But if they are causing masking, then we should have a close listen to it, and if necessary, really do equalization to get rid of it, which I did, for instance, in the case of this 80 Hertz dip to make room for the bass drum, because the bass drum is really going on all the time and should have some room to live in, so to say. Okay, this is what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found it interesting and got something out of it. I hope I see you again. Give me your feedback. I am grateful for any, encouragement for what I'm doing, and also criticism, of course. So if I can improve anything, then just let me know what you think. Until then, see you next time, and take care. Bye-bye.